Our scripture reading is in your bulletin, and we will be looking pretty much at all of chapter 41, and actually chapter 40 and 41 of Genesis. Excuse me. I'll call. When 2 full years passed, Pharoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile. When out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the aisle and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. And then Pharoh woke up. He fell asleep again, and he had a second dream, and 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. And then 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharoah woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and the wise men of Egypt. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but no one could interpret them for him. In the movie The Karate Kid, the remake. Now, I've seen both of them. I remember Wax On, Wax Off. But in the movie, the remake of The Karate Kid, Jaden Smith, Will Smith's son, plays the hero, a young man by the name of Dre. And he and his family, they moved from Detroit to China. And he ended up getting on the wrong side of a bully who beat him up because he knew Kung Fu. And then Dre was going to learn Kung Fu from a guy by the name of Mr. Han, who was played by Jackie Chan, who is going to teach Dre Kung Fu. So I want to show you a clip of the first part where Dre has his first encounter with Mr. Han.
Mr. Han?
Right here.
You know you have a car in your living room, Mr. Han. Okay. I was thinking about yesterday. I know that I was kind of freaking out about the tournament, but I realized something last night. I'm an athlete. My number 1 asset is I'm fast, okay? I'm quick. All right? I'm quick. Got speed. Cat speed. Bow, bow. See? I'm quick, yeah. See, and I used to take gymnastics at PAL. That's the Police Athletic League, so check it, right? Boom, you see that? Boom, you see that? Yeah. See? My Uncle Ray and me used to date this Brazilian girl, and he learned jiu-jitsu, and he taught some of it to me. And it's like locks and holds and stuff, so okay. Attack me. See that? Hear that? I could break it. I'm choosing not to. It's a pressure lock. Dangerous. Oh, and he also taught me capoeira, so can't touch me. Can't. That antique.
Pick up your jacket.
Oh. So basically, Mr. Han, what I'm trying to say is, I got a good foundation here. You know, like I said, I'm just... Might not be as hard to teach me as other people, you know?
Hand it up.
Okay. All right, but now...
Take it down.
You just...
Take it down. Put it on. Take it off.
I already did all
Take
this.
it off.
You just tell me why I'm
Take
doing this?
it off. Hand it up. Take it down. Put it in the ground. Pick it up. Hang up. Take it down. Put it on. Take it off. Put it in the ground. Pick it up. Hang it up. Take it down. Put it on. Take it off. Hang it up.
Mr. Hahn, why do you have a car in your living room?
No street parking.
Hey! So how did it go? What'd you learn?
Nothing.
At the start of the movie, Dre never picks up his coat. And his mother is always telling him to pick it up, and he doesn't pick it up. He goes to Mr. Hahn. He does all of this stuff. And what's he learn? Pick it up, hang it up, take it off, put it on, take it off, put it down, pick it up, hang it up. He comes home, what's his mom say to him? What'd you learn? But did you notice? He hung up his coat. You have my next slide there. We can go right to the next clip if you're ready for the next clip. Here's what happens when Dre gets sick of picking up, taking off, putting on, putting off, all of this stuff. Get it? It's thinking. Yeah, so is Trey. Can't do anything. We tried twice. All righty. Well, bummer. Worked well in rehearsal anyway. Yeah, technology is great when it works and it's terrible when it doesn't work. Well, how many of you saw the movie? All right, so you really, I was going to show you the clip where what happens is that Dre goes up to Mr. Hahn and he gripes and he complains, saying, "You don't know Kung Fu." And so he's mad. And then Mr. Hahn says, "Come over here." And so reluctantly, Dre goes over to him and he says, "Put on your jacket." As he starts to put on the jacket, he knocks the jacket away from him. You remember now. And he says, "Show me, put on your jacket." As he starts to make the motions, he grabs his arm and he says, "Strong. Do it, strong." And then he rotates him. He says, "Put on jacket." And he says, "Always strong." And he says, "Show me, take off jacket." And then he starts to do this and he grabs his arm again. He goes, "Strong, always strong." He says, "Right foot back, right foot back." And then he starts throwing all these punches at him. And Dre starts doing all of the motions of jacket on, jacket off, ducking, picking up, and blocks all of Mr. Hahn's actions. Then he gets this amazing look on his face. And Mr. Hahn grabs him and he says, everything is Kung Fu. From the way we put on our jacket and the way we take our jacket off to the way we treat people. Now, what does all of this have to do with Joseph? For 13 years, Joseph has been picking up, hanging up, taking off, putting on, taking off, putting down, picking up, and hanging up. All of this time, he thinks that he's in prison. He thinks that he hasn't accomplished anything. If you were to ask Joseph, what have you learned? What would he say? Nothing. I haven't learned anything. I have spent 13 years living as a slave. I've spent 13 years living as a prisoner. I haven't learned anything. All I've been doing is picking up, hanging up, taking off, putting on, taking off, putting down, picking up, and hanging up. He doesn't think that he has learned absolutely a thing. Where we last left off, Joseph is in Potiphar's prison. Now, the amazing thing about this is that it's amazing that Joseph is even alive. He's been accused of trying to molest or to rape Potiphar's wife. The penalty for that is not jail. The penalty for that is death. He should have been killed immediately. But instead, Potiphar puts him in prison. And the irony of this thing is where the prison is the prison would have been at Potiphar's basement, or it would have been on Potiphar's estate somewhere, because Potiphar did not want to lose the services of Joseph. So he puts him in a secure place where he is still able to handle all of Potiphar's affairs without having an affair with Potiphar's wife. Now, that was a really clever saying, by the way. That should have gotten, yeah, I got that. But it's the irony of that is to where Potiphar puts Joseph so that he can still be working for him. And what Joseph is learning is he's learning how to be an administrator. He's learning how to lead. He's learning how to serve. He's learning humility. He's learning all of these things, and all the time what he thinks he's learning is picking up, hanging up, taking off, putting on, taking off, putting on the ground, picking up, and hanging up again. Well, I know where we are on the slideshow that you get caught up with that. Things are going to change for Joseph. All of this time, he thinks he's not learning anything. And what we need to realize is that God has had a plan for Joseph's life all along. And where this plan begins to come to fruition now is when there are two other people who are put into Potiphar's jail. Joseph has now risen to where he is in charge of the jail. Not only is he in charge of all of Potiphar's estate and still running that stuff, he's running the prison as well. And so two prisoners are brought into Joseph's care. And one of these prisoners is the chief butler, and the other one is the chief baker. Now, when we think of a butler, we think of some guy in an English coat or something like that. But what a butler actually is he is the wine taster, and he's also the food taster for the Pharaoh and all of Pharaoh's household. And the baker is in charge of buying, purchasing, and preparing all of the food for Pharaoh's household and anybody who eats at Pharaoh's table. Now, this isn't just some short-order cook at McDonald's, and it's not just the high-end wine waiter at the high-end restaurant somewhere. These guys have national security clearance. And something happened to Pharaoh's food security. This is a major issue. And so these two guys were arrested while investigation is undergoing. Now, who's going to be doing the investigation? Potiphar, because he is the chief of the national security force. And so he's running the background check to see what's been going on here, and he wants to make sure that these two very important officials in Pharaoh's court are well treated while they're in prison. So he puts them under Joseph's care, the person who he has the most trust in, to make sure that there isn't going to be any back thing coming back if these two guys are to be found innocent. And so Joseph is ministering to these two very important officials. And one morning, he comes into the prison and is seen to their needs, and he finds out that they're sad. And the reason they're sad is because they had had a dream. Now, in ancient cultures, as well as cultures today, dreams are oftentimes seen as foretelling the future. And so these two people, they had had these dreams, and they're sad because they don't know what the dreams mean. And there's nobody from Pharaoh's court, there's none of the magicians, there's none of the priests, there's nobody there who can interpret the dream for them. And so they're depressed and they're discouraged. And Joseph, he sees this. And so he asks them and he says, "What's wrong? Why are you downcast?" As though being in prison wouldn't be reason enough. But he says, "Why are you downcast?" And they tell him, "Well, we had these dreams and we don't know what they mean." Now, when we read this, we just, it just goes over our head because we don't understand how radical the statement is. When Joseph says to them that dreams and the interpretation of dreams come from God. This is Egypt. They worship many gods. They would find it distressing that anybody would say that there is one God. And yet Joseph has the boldness to say that dreams come from God of the Hebrews, from Yahweh, and that he is the one who interprets dreams. Well, the first preaching point that I want to make for us is that Joseph was an evangelist. Joseph was an evangelist. Now, he doesn't preach at them. He doesn't launch into some theological discussion. He doesn't get in a debate with them about the gods of the Nile versus the gods of the Jordan River or anything like that at all. What Joseph does is he simply sees that these guys are in distress. And he shows compassion to them, and he inquires as to what is happening in their life. And then what he does is he just simply introduces God into the equation. He doesn't preach at him. He just simply says that the God of the Hebrews, the God of Yahweh, is present. He's the one who gives dreams, and he's the one who interprets dreams for us. The message I see for us is that we can be evangelists, and we should be evangelists. We oftentimes think that in order to be evangelists that you have to have a theological degree or you have to have some sort of professional religious training or you have to be able to argue theologically, and that's the last thing you really need to be or to do. All you need to do is to just simply be willing to introduce Jesus into the equation. That when you see that people are hurt, when people are troubled, to just simply have the boldness to ask them, "What's wrong? What are you feeling?" And then to offer to pray not for them, but with them. To actually pray with them. And you don't have to say anything profound. You just simply, "Dear Jesus, be with them as they are struggling with this." And introduce Jesus into the equation. Say a good word. That's what it means to be an evangelist. And that is something that each and every one of us can do. Open the possibility of the divine. So that's what Joseph does. And so these guys, they tell him their dream. And so the butler goes first. He says that I had a dream where I saw 3 vines, and I took the grapes from these vines and I pressed them into the cup, and I gave them to Pharaoh, and he drank from it. And then the baker told his dream. He says, I had a dream where I saw 3 baskets on my head that were full of bread, and birds were eating from the bread out of the top basket. And so then Joseph interprets the dream for them. He says, well, the dream means in 3 days, because you had 3 baskets and you had 3 vines. And he says to the butler, what's going to happen is in 3 days, you're going to come back to Pharaoh's court, and he's going to restore you. Once again, you are going to offer, wine to Pharaoh, and you're going to be his chief food taster and prepare food for him. And then he says to him, when you come before Pharaoh, remember me to Pharaoh, because I am in prison unjustly. I have done nothing wrong, which is true. He hadn't done anything wrong. Well, the baker, when he heard the favorable interpretation of the dream, he says, great, this should be good. And so he says, well, what's my dream mean? And then Joseph says to him, well, your dream means that in 3 days, you're also going to be lifted up before Pharaoh because you're going to be hung by the neck until you die. Needless to say, he doesn't tell the baker to remember him before Pharaoh. And sure enough, the dreams came true. After 3 days, the butler and the baker appeared before Pharaoh. Pharaoh hung the baker, but the butler he restored to his position of authority. Now, I think the butler had good intentions of telling Pharaoh about Joseph. I think he wanted to tell him about Joseph, and he was probably thinking, well, I'll wait till the right time when I have the right opportunity. And guess what? The right opportunity never came. The right time never came. And so he forgot. And so Joseph continued to be in prison for 2 years. 2 more years. So if you were to ask Joseph, what have you learned? Put it up, how to hang it up, how to take it off, how to put it on, how to take it off, how to put it down, how to pick it up, how to hang it up. Joseph, what'd you learn? Nothing. Haven't learned a darn thing. If he was being cynical, what would he say? Can't trust anybody. Anybody you trust, they end up just forgetting you. They throw you in jail. You can't trust your brothers because they sell you out. You can't trust Potiphar because he let you go to prison when it was his wife who was the one who was guilty. You can't trust the butler because he doesn't remember you before Pharaoh. But what has Joseph learned? He has learned the Egyptian language. He's learned Egyptian culture. He's learned Egyptian politics. He's learned about Egyptian national security. He's learned about Egyptian agriculture. He's learned how to serve. He's learned how to lead. He's learned how to delegate. He's learned how to manage. And he has learned how to work with people of all stations in Egypt, from those who are prisoners to those who are high officials. Joseph has learned a great deal, but he thinks he's learned nothing. Well, all of that is going to change in a moment. The event that changed that was Pharaoh and a dream. We're 2 years later now into the story. And Pharaoh has this troubling dream that we read about, with the cows coming up out of the river and then the skinny cows eating them all up and the fat girls' ears of corn getting swallowed up by the skinny ears of corn. And he appeals to his magicians and priests, and none of them can give him an interpretation of the dream, because who do dreams come from, and where do the interpretation of dreams come from? They come from God. Now the butler suddenly has an aha moment, or a duh moment. He goes, duh. Now I remember when I was in prison a couple years ago. You don't really remember that, do you, Pharoah? But anyway, you got mad at me 2 years ago. And while I was in prison, there was a young Hebrew there who could interpret dreams. And so Pharaoh summons for Joseph. And we're told that Joseph comes before him. And then there's a line in here that we oftentimes see as a throwaway line, but this is an extremely important line. Is we are told that Joseph shaves and he changes his clothes. Now, why is that important? How do Hebrews look? They wear a beard. Joseph is almost 30 years old now. He is 30 years old now. He has a beard. He doesn't cut his hair. He has the frontlets that come down. He looks like a Hebrew. And what he does is he shaves, because the Egyptians are clean shaven. He puts on new clothes. Now, who would have allowed Joseph to shave, shower, and put on clean clothes? Take a guess. Potiphar. For 13 years, Joseph has been working as Potiphar's hand, and his right-hand man. He's been his advisor. He's been running his business. Now, all of a sudden, there's going to be a turnabout as Potiphar is going to be Joseph's advisor. And he knows that if Joseph is going to come before Pharaoh, in order to be heard by Pharaoh, he cannot go in there looking like a Hebrew slave or a prisoner. And so he shaves so that he looks Egyptian. He's going to speak Egyptian. And he's not going to go in there wearing prison garments, but he's going to go in there dressed as though he is one of Potiphar's best servants and not as a prisoner. When Joseph comes into the room, he comes in as a man with a plan. He comes in as a man with a plan. So Pharaoh says, I hear that you can interpret dreams. And Joseph says, it's not me that interpret dreams. It is God who interprets dreams. And he is going to give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Now here's where Joseph is being an evangelist again. And we don't realize how radical this is, that he would say to Pharaoh, who himself is seen as a god, and he says to him that there is a God, the God of the Hebrews, the God of Yahweh. Even though I look like an Egyptian and I sound like Egyptian, I am still a Hebrew. And I still serve Yahweh. And it is Yahweh who is going to give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And Pharaoh listens to him. And so he tells him the dream. And he tells him about the 7 cows and the 7 ears of corn and all this stuff. And then Joseph says, here's what the dream means. He says that there is going to be 7 years of great plenty. And it's going to be followed by 7 years of a terrible drought. And the drought and the famine is going to be so bad that it's going to swallow up all of the good years so that nobody will remember the good years. And because the dream is doubled, it means that this is certain and it's going to happen soon. Now, Joseph should have just shut up at this point, right? That was all he was asked to do, was to come in and interpret the dream and then leave. But he doesn't. He gives advice to Pharaoh. Pharaoh didn't ask for his advice, but he gives it anyway. He gives counsel to Pharaoh. And he says, Pharaoh, and this is what you should do. You should find a wise person, a wise man, who understands Egyptian agriculture, who understands the Egyptian culture, and is able to collect a tax of 1/5 of all of the produce, of all the bounty, is able to be a builder, to be able to build granaries or storage facilities for all of this grain, and then has the ability to distribute this grain when the famine starts in a manner that won't result in rioting, so that the country can survive the 7 years of drought from the 7 years of plenty. And Pharaoh listens to this counsel and this advice, and not only does he listen to it, but what does he do next? He says, you're the man. You're the man with the plan. And so he makes Joseph a combination of the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of State, and the Prime Minister. And that he gives him the ability to build these granaries, to tax the people, to collect these goods and all of this produce, and then to distribute it. Now, do you realize how incredible that is, that Pharaoh would listen to Joseph, let alone put him in charge of all of these things that he has done? What have we learned about Joseph's character? We learned that Joseph is courteous. He's courteous and he's humble and he's intelligent. And so he comes in and he doesn't address the Pharaoh, in an uncourteous manner, but instead he shaves and he speaks the language of Egypt because he's showing courtesy. He's not coming in with any sort of a chip on his shoulder. He is a man of incredible honor. Incredible honor. We saw this honor first in the way that he treated Potiphar's wife, and he would not have the affair with her, but in the way that he has been dealing with all of the people that have been in his life. He has incredible courage and boldness that he is able to speak this advice to Pharaoh. And the other thing that I notice here is he doesn't negotiate. He was in a position of power. He could have said to Pharaoh, I will interpret the dream for you if you get me out of prison, if you let me go home. That's what his father Jacob would have done. But Joseph doesn't negotiate. He is content with his point in life. And if that means that he goes back to prison, then he'll go back to prison. But he doesn't do any negotiating. He just simply says, this is what the dream means, and this is what I would suggest that you would do. And Pharaoh recognizes that God is with Joseph. Now again, you realize how radical that is. Here's a guy who's seen as being God by the people of the Egyptians, who worships all these various gods of Egypt, and yet he recognizes that God is at work in Joseph. That's our second preaching point. Do people see God at work in you? They see God at work in us, in me. You see, Joseph didn't have to really say anything. His reputation preceded him. The butler vouched for him. Potiphar obviously must have vouched for him. Other people must have vouched for him. So that when Joseph gives advice, Pharaoh not only listens to it, but he takes it because he understands that God is at work in this young man's life. Do people see God at work in us? Francis of Assisi is the one who is credited with saying, preach the gospel always, use words when necessary. You heard that? Heard that phrase or something similar to that, where he says, preach the gospel always, but use words when necessary. That's because our lifestyle should be such that we don't have to say much. People see God at work in us. Last week I was beating up on myself a little bit because I was telling you about my golf game. How I had my meltdown out there and I was upset about that. You know why that bothered me so much? Not just because I had a bad golf game, but the meltdown. Is because it undermined lifestyle evangelism. If that guy I was playing with, and he saw that meltdown out there, and then if I were to say to him, gee, Terry, would you like to go to church with me? After seeing that meltdown, what would he think? Why would I go to church with you, let alone with anybody, if this is what a Christian is? If having a temper tantrum and a meltdown and doing that, you're worse than I am. Why in the world would I ever want to go to church? We can undermine our ministry, our lifestyle evangelism. And that's what disturbed me. That's what I had to share with the guys on Saturday then, is that was the problem. Not just losing my temper on a golf course. That was the symptom. What would have been better is if instead of having a meltdown out there, I could have said, well, I'm obviously not playing very well, and able to demonstrate grace and allow them to have a good time even though I wasn't. So that then if I'd have said, gee, Terry, would you like to go to church with me? He would think, gee, why not? Here's a guy who's having a lousy golf game. If I were him, I'd be throwing my clubs and saying all kinds of things, and instead, he's making sure that I have a good time. Preach the gospel always. Use words when necessary. Joseph didn't need to use a lot of words. His character vouched for him. So Pharaoh was able to hear what he said. Joseph's reputation preceded him. All of this time, Joseph thought he was just picking up, hanging up, taking off, putting on, taking off, putting down, picking up, hanging up. How many of you feel like that's all you're doing? Same routine over and over and over again. If people were to ask you, what have you learned? Nothing. Haven't learned a darn thing. Get cynical. Can't trust people. People are jerks. They don't take good care of you all of this time. But yet, God was using all of these things. Joseph's imprisonment, Joseph's being solicited by Potiphar's wife, Joseph being a slave. God was using all of these things for just this moment. Joseph is now 30 years old, and he becomes the prime minister of Egypt. He's given a new name. We don't really know what this name means. Zaphaneth Paneah. Our best bet is it has something to do with one who interprets dreams, but this is the only place where this word shows up, and there's no Rosetta Stone anywhere sort of thing that would give us a clue as to what the name really means, but our best guess is that it probably means something about somebody who interprets dreams. Joseph does everything that he says he's going to do. He builds the granaries. He gets the tax of 1/5 of the grain. He collects all of this grain. He stores it. And then when the famine starts and the people come to Pharaoh and they say that we have no grain, Pharaoh refers them to Joseph, and Joseph begins to sell them the grain in such a manner that there aren't any food riots. That people are able to come and to get the food that they need. Everything is working out exactly the way that it was supposed to work out. Pharaoh gives Joseph a wife. Now, the reason he gives him a wife is because being a Hebrew in an Egyptian court is forbidden. So he gets an Egyptian name so that it's more palatable that he would be on Pharaoh's court. He gives him an Egyptian wife to make sure that it's even more, agreeable to everybody else. And then she gives him 2 children. He names the first one Ephraim and the second one Manasseh, or is it the other way around? Manasseh and then Ephraim. The name Manasseh means he makes me forget. The name Ephraim means fruitful. And what most scholars and what I suspect the meaning of those names is that when his wife gives him this little boy, he says, your name will be Manasseh, because God has made me forget the bitterness of prison. God has made me forget slavery. Made me forget the betrayal of my brothers. He's made me forget picking up, hanging up, taking off, putting on, taking off, putting down, picking up. Then when she gave him the second bouncing boy, he says, your name is going to be Ephraim, because I am fruitful. I am 30 years old now. Actually, he'd be 37, 38 at this point. And I have 2 children. I have a wife. I'm no longer in prison. God has made me fruitful. What's the application for us? I actually am getting over the cold, believe it or not. The application for us is that in that movie, Jackie Chan said, everything is kung fu. Everything is not kung fu. Everything is God. God is at work in everything. Now, I don't think it was God's will that Joseph be betrayed by his brothers. I don't think it was God's will that he would end up in prison, that it was God's will that he would be, seduced by Potiphar's wife, and that she would, slander him, and all these horrible things would happen to him. But what I do know is that God was able to use each and every one of these events in Joseph's life so that they served a purpose. So that at the right time, it wasn't he learned nothing, but that he learned everything, that God was with him. So the implication for us is, where in your life, when you look at your life, do you find yourself picking up, hanging up, taking off, putting on, taking off, putting down, and you don't think you're learning anything, and you don't think God has anything in mind for you, any plan whatsoever? What I would propose to us and say to us that God is at work. He has a plan. Remember the prayer I asked us to look at last week? Dear God, what do you need to do in my life now in order that you can use me for your service tomorrow? How many of you prayed that prayer this week? Dangerous prayer. That's what's happening with Joseph. Dear God, what do you need to do in my life now that you can use me tomorrow? Well, the tomorrow is to save the world, save his people. What did God need to do in Joseph's life now? He needed to be a ruler. He needed to learn how to be a ruler. He learned that from the best possible teacher possible, Potiphar, in Pharaoh's court. God just might be using some of the things in your life that you think are crap. Instead, is working them around for you to do great things. Let us pray.